So energy media readers, today we have a special treat. We're going to be interviewing Shawn McCarthy, who recently retired from the Globe and Mail as their energy journalist. And welcome to the interview, Shawn.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Now, you've been doing this for a long time, and you're based in Ottawa, so you've got your finger on the pulse of federal politics and what's going on in the debates in Parliament amongst the players, as it were. And what we're going to talk about today is the climate plans, and particularly the Liberal climate plan and its implementation, what that means for Alberta. And I've written a column. I said basically that Alberta has a Canada problem, but Canada also has an Alberta problem, because all roads to GHG reductions run through Alberta, where 11% of the population produces 36% of national emissions, and the oil sands are 11% all on their own. So let me toss it over to you. What's your general take on this?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I agree with you that Canada has an Alberta problem, and we don't get this. We don't get to where we want to be in terms of a country. Which, remember, every party in Parliament signed on to the Paris Accord, and so there was a commitment from every party in Parliament to meet these targets, and in fact to go beyond them, because that was what was required in the Paris Accord. So absolutely, Alberta needs to be part of the solution. I think, first of all, there are areas where the federal government and Alberta may be able to cooperate if we can get past the frayed feelings of the election and sort of move on to a more constructive political ground. I do think there are areas where they can cooperate. I think that there are areas that the federal government has to focus on that have nothing to do with Alberta, other than consumers in that province. So housing and transportation and other industry, where there is again an opportunity to really tackle emissions. And I think that illustrates to the Albertans that this isn't all about them, which is kind of an Alberta feeling these days, and we see it with the foreign funded radicals, that everything's about Alberta and everybody hates Alberta. And no, it's not about Alberta. It's about emissions. It's about climate change. It's about ensuring that we leave a planet for our children and grandchildren where it's not some dystopian nightmare. So I do think that there are areas where A, we can change the channel a little bit, and B, we can cooperate a little bit. But C, there are going to be areas of conflict, and there's no question about that, if the federal government is determined to not only meet that 30%, but exceed it, which is what the promise is now that Trudeau enunciated in the election.
I've been a big proponent over the years of, or opponent, I guess, of this Alberta feeling that they're being picked on by the rest of Canada. And the
rest of the world.
Exactly. And I spent a lot of time in the Abacus data survey data, because what it shows very clearly is that about 20% of Canadians are going to be opposed to oil, opposed to more pipelines. And there's a big chunk in the middle that really just aren't paying attention. But then the group that are in support of it really are about twice the size of the opponents. So this feeling that Alberta is being picked on, really what they're doing, in my opinion, is they're taking the opposition from the BC environmental groups, and they're making themselves into victims. It's very much a political strategy. It's a populist kind of strategy. Kenney has certainly played into that. But you're based in Ottawa. What do the folks out there, what do Eastern Canadians think about all this?
Well, so Eastern Canadians, I think what you say is very true about Ontario. Quebec is a different story. So, I think a litmus test for Eastern Canada, if you will, was the Energy East pipeline. And frankly, it would have been, we never tested it, so we don't know, because they pulled the plug on it. TransCanada did before it got to that test. But it was going to be very difficult politically to get that pipeline through Quebec. It could have gone through Ontario with no problem, I think, and New Brunswick, of course. But Quebec is an issue on that score. I think people in Ontario and the 905 area, which was so crucial, the suburbs of Toronto, to the election, the polling afterwards and before said, climate change is a big issue. People want serious effort on climate change. And so, if Alberta is all about saying no, no, no on climate change, then they're going to lose the rest of the country. Rachel Notley, I think, played a constructive role. Kenney has, with the new industrial policy, emissions policy, signaled a willingness to take it seriously, and I'm told there are going to be more things coming in that regard. So I think the broad swath of Canadians are supportive of Alberta's effort, as the Liberals characterize it, and we want to both get our resources to market, but also deal with climate change. But then you have to deal with the environmentalists who frankly don't hold sway except in maybe BC and Quebec, where governments are going to oppose it, and the Indigenous communities, where you might have 2/3 of the Indigenous communities even behind you for a long linear pipeline, but if you get concerted opposition on the ground where they go to court, then you have problems, and that's what we're seeing with DMX.
Yeah, the what's going on in Eastern Canada is fascinating to me. It is around Energy East, because when TransCanada, now TC Energy, pulled the plug in November of 2017, I wrote a series of columns that said, you know what, I don't think that the Liberals really want to fight this issue in the 2019 election. And given the fact that Trump had put Keystone XL back on the table in the spring, and TransCanada couldn't find enough oil to fill 2 pipelines, I thought maybe, and I speculated, I granted, that maybe the Liberals had used the NEB, the National Energy Board, and the downstream emissions requirement to give TransCanada a little nudge, to get them out of Energy East. Now, that's speculation on my part, but certainly I think Professor Andrew Leach has made the case pretty well that economics and the business interest drove the decision to abandon Energy East.
Right.
But I agree with you about that. So what role, given the fact that Quebec is very pro climate policy and so on, how much of a push are they going to give Trudeau when the time comes to negotiate the national carbon budget and Alberta's sitting at the table?
Well, I mean, do we get a negotiation on a national climate budget? We didn't in the last 4 years. I mean, it's still not very clear how we get from here to there, and it was more of a sectoral discussion in terms of what a climate budget might look like. It was never very explicit for very obvious reasons, I think, because of the politics. So, I mean, Quebec, in my view, Quebec doesn't care much about what goes on beyond Quebec. Quebec would like to see, certainly Quebec voters want to see Canada take a more aggressive stand on this. They have their limits in terms of what they want to pay. I mean, the carbon tax in Quebec is lower than it is elsewhere because of the cap and trade system, which keeps the price down, in fact. Which was a bit of an issue when it was first negotiated with the Western provinces. But I think that whether there's a pipeline to BC or whether the oil sands get to 100 megatons of emissions or stay under that, is not a front of mind issue for Quebecers. What a pipeline through the province is, and they can be certainly engaged on that. But I do think that, there is more wiggle room in this than you might think. And if it's not a matter of sitting premiers around the table and negotiating a carbon budget, which then we have to do all the horse trading. But I mean, frankly, you've heard from Ontario, and you've heard Doug Ford say, Ontario has done its share. We're on track to meet what was the national target, which is, 30% below 2005 levels. We're on track to meet that. And everybody goes back and says, yeah, but Ontario has to do more because Alberta's not on. And the implicit argument from Ontario is, if we're going to meet this target, Alberta and Saskatchewan have to do more because we're not going to go as far as the previous Liberal government said we needed to go. So, there's a whole bunch of things that need to get worked out. I don't know, you mentioned how much Alberta represents in terms of national emissions. I don't know how you can get to 500, slightly more than 500 megatons nationally by 2030 if the oil sands alone represent 100 megatons of it. I mean, that's 20% of national emissions coming from one sector. Is a lot. So, can the industry lays out a whole bunch of aspirational goals about how much they can bring down emissions from extraction, and some of it sounds actually pretty encouraging and exciting, but right now it's still aspirational, which doesn't get you where you need to go.
Well, I think part of the problem there is the fact that the deal that the oil sands CEOs, there were 5 of them in 2014, 2015, the deal that they made with the environmental groups,
right,
that Notley enshrined in the Climate Leadership Plan, is they would they would trade an emissions cap for no production cap. So
right,
as long as they were continuing to bring down emissions, they could raise production. And the idea was that, there was, 75 or 72 megatons at the time. Now we're in the high 70s. And the hope was that they could add another 1 million barrels a day to production and not go over 80. And certainly not go over 90.
Certainly not go over 100, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see how that plays out. But certainly there is, I don't think, any anticipation within the oil sands industry that they are actually going to see an absolute reduction in emissions. They're not going to go down from, let's say, 80 to 60.
No. And part of the problem is they're shifting as you shift from mines to the in situ. The production in situ is higher, has been higher, and we emission per barrel, and there's a lot of talk of solvents and so on, and some field tests of it, but we haven't really seen it in large commercial projects yet. And so again, it's aspirational. We're being told it's all out there to be done, but it hasn't, because there's not a lot of investment going in. Somebody made an interesting point to me too, which is that this push to invest in innovation, there's not much incentive to innovate if you're not increasing your production. So if you're just going to essentially maintain production, you can debottleneck and increase it on the margin a bit. There's some incentive to innovate to bring down your costs, but anything beyond a straight cost reduction, which is where we've gotten the improvements over the last several years that people talk about. There have been per barrel improvements, but it's a result of companies investing in operational efficiencies that bring down their energy costs at the same time they bring down emissions. So it's a win-win, but their threshold for that is pretty high in terms of rate of return.
That's right. And of course, we can't forget that these oil sands companies are big public companies, and they have to show investors, they have to compete for capital, and they have to show investors a growth scenario. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to compete for capital.
Utilities for years ran without a big growth scenario. I mean, it's you pay a solid dividend, you bring down your costs on a regular basis, and this idea that you have to, as a corporate entity, constantly grow, that's a growth story, sure, in the market, but there are stocks that are not growth stocks, that are solid dividend stocks that are very attractive to people, especially in times of low interest rates. So maybe you reposition it a little bit in terms of what investors are expecting.
Yeah, that's a story we should follow as time goes on, and what messages those companies are actually sending investors, that they feel that they need to tell, the stories they need to tell in order to attract capital. Now, Shawn, I want to go back and talk about something that you touched upon, which is Ontario and Doug Ford and
Right.
its position around this. And I maintain that part of Alberta's problem is that Alberta, and by Alberta, I mean the politicians and the industry,
Right.
find themselves partly in this position they do now because they haven't played their politics very well. And they, Notley, I think, I wrote a book in the spring called The New Alberta Advantage, Technology Policy and the Future of the Oil Sands. And I argued that Notley had made a good start and the oil sands companies had the right approach of decarbonization in order to compete in Asian markets. That was great. But now we see Kenney. The Kenney for me represents the old oil patch, the 1980s, those kind of guys. And that is bad politics in Ottawa. I think it's bad politics. Ultimately, whenever Kenney and Ford may sing Kumbaya on the stage, ultimately it will be bad politics. And I'm curious what you think about that and how industry in particular has played its hand on the national stage and in Ottawa.
Well, I think you're right. I think Kenney has campaigned as the old style guy, and now again there are some key moments coming up where we're going to see whether he is. Part of what drives him is the international financial community, and if you're talking about attracting capital, which is why Canada headed for the U.S. because they said there were better access to capital. And if your goal is to attract international capital, you have to have a credible climate change story to tell, and that includes government regulation that backs it up. So I think they're well aware of that, and I know some people in the Premier's office who talk about that, and it'll be interesting to see if the Premier can change channels a little bit and go from just essentially almost like no carbon policy, which really he wasn't, but that was the message, to something a little more modern and sophisticated. Ontario came in with they end a cap and trade and promised their own policies, and we've seen virtually nothing from them since. And so, I think Ontario doesn't have a lot of credibility on the climate agenda itself, the Ford government, and so industry would like to see. One thing industry definitely wants to see is federal and provincial governments working together and not using this as a political football. That's the worst possible outcome for industry. They would rather have a policy that is not optimal for them, but they can count on, through more than one election cycle, than having to be ping pong back and forth. I'm mixing my football and ping pong metaphors, but there you go. So I think that they want to see consistency, and they're the corporate sector here is, I think, supportive of some climate policy. One of the things, and talk about fodder for the next column, one of the things that I want to turn my mind to is 2020 in the United States is a massive election for a whole bunch of reasons, and none more so than on climate policy in the United States, but also in Canada. Because if you get a Democrat in the White House that is pushing climate policy forward, and it's putting costs on industry in the United States and so on, the Canadian sector can't come to Ottawa all the time and say, or doesn't, they can, but it's less credible to come and say, our costs in the US we don't face this in the US. We have to be very careful. Yes, we're all in favor of climate policy, but you can't drive business away to the United States. And there's some truth to that. And so, a Canadian climate ecosystem under a Democratic government starting in January 2021 is much, much different than under a Trump government continuing in 2021. So that is going to, I think, be a huge factor in how this thing plays out on this side of the border.
I would agree with you. And does that mean that we might see Trudeau tread water a little bit on the climate file until that gets settled in 2020, late 2020?
So they like to consult. They promised a more aggressive climate policy, and they have to come up with some areas where they can play that out. But they are faced with a couple of big decisions, and again, going back to, okay, where do we have this conflict with Alberta? What are they going to do with the Teck frontier mine in northern Alberta that the regulator essentially recommended approval, but said that it will add to the GHG and other environmental impacts in northern Alberta. So that's a decision that has to get made that it will either anger Albertans if the Liberals say no, or it will anger those partners, the NDP, the Greens, the Bloc, and say, how serious are you about climate policy if you're approving this thing that's going to pump out a couple million tons of emissions? Methane regulations, Alberta, both the province and the federal government passed methane regulations. Alberta wants equivalency to run with its own regs. The environmental groups all say they're not equivalent. The Alberta regs are far more lenient and want the federal government to impose its own. Another area where you get some fighting and potential battle. And then if, the pipeline issue, I think if Trans Mountain, it will proceed and it will get built. And I think nobody's going to come forward with a new pipeline proposal for a while, for a couple of years. So that gives some respite on that, I think. Yeah, there's going to be conflict there, but they will be as deliberate as they can. And I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how quickly they come up with a new target for 2030, because that's what they're being. I think it's the next UN summit in December 2020 where they're supposed to come forward with a new target for 2030.
What's your take on the role that the NDP in particular, but maybe even Elizabeth May and the Green Party might play in, keeping the Liberals' feet to the fire on the climate file?
Oh, I think they're going to make things very uncomfortable for Trudeau, and the Bloc as well. They're going to make things very uncomfortable for Trudeau, and as I say the Teck frontier mine, the Liberals approved that, and there will be, they will be criticized left, right, and center from, well, maybe not right, but they will be criticized from even the center and the left from about allowing yet another oil sands project that will drive up emissions. The challenge that the NDP and the Bloc and Elizabeth May have is that there's not a lot of legislation that is required to do the things that the Liberals want to do, and so there's not really a confidence vote there. Maybe that's a good thing for those opposition parties, because they won't be faced with bringing the government down over climate policy, which I don't think anybody wants an election for the next 18 months, 2 years, but they can certainly criticize, and they will, and they'll be looking to gain ground at the Liberal expense for the next election, which 2 years away, on the basis of Trudeau not delivering on climate change. So the Liberals really are in a very tough spot. I mean, they have the Alberta, which is, this conflagration of opinion in Alberta, and any political effort to impose climate policy on Alberta will be fought, Saskatchewan as well. And then on the other hand, anything that falls short of doing that will be deeply opposed by the NDP, the Green, the Bloc, and some key riding. Quebec as a political entity, and to some degree BC as well, and the urban centers around Toronto.
Well, Shawn, thank you very much for doing this. And any final thoughts on the politics of climate policy and how that's going to play out in, say, the next 3 to 6 months?
Common ground is what I'm looking for, and the degree to which Jason Kenney is, and Trudeau, but Trudeau, I think, wants common ground. The degree to which Jason Kenney wants common ground, or is he just content to hammer the Liberals and make every sparrow that falls on the climate change policy, an issue of yet another battle? And given it's a minority government, and given that they would like a conservative government the next time around, they will battle Trudeau on this. But the politics of it now, so it has to be apparent to the Conservatives nationally that you can shut out the Liberals in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where this feeling is so strong, and it doesn't do you a lot of good, because they still can win government and could have won if Quebec, if the Bloc hadn't come on strong. We could have had a Liberal majority government while being shut out on the prairies. So that's not a recipe for getting what you want in Canada out of a federal government. So maybe plan B would be somebody should come up with a plan B, maybe.
Well, I tell you what I'm going to be looking for, and I'm going to be looking to see how industry handles this, because I've been sharply critical of CAP, and it's tacking to I really think that they've been inspired by Trump, and particularly Rick Perry, the energy secretary, because Perry has been very articulate, actually, about a vision that he calls innovation, not regulation, and new energy realism, I guess, is his catchphrase.
Right.
And you see that echo, you see the evolution over the last 2 years in CAP's policy papers as they've been tacking in that direction. And then you saw exactly that kind of approach taken by Scheer and the CPC in their climate plan.
Right.
So I'm very curious to see if industry can now tack back to the center and be part of this, détente with Trudeau and try to get things done, or if in fact industry is gearing up, girding its loins for another big fight. And I think that will have a big bearing on what Kenney does.
Ironically, I think that, it was the oil sands executives who played the middle ground to some extent. And as you said, they did the deal with Rachel Notley. They are accepting of carbon tax. They accepted the 100 megaton limit. And so CAP in some ways represented more of the independent, more politically engaged oil sands executives. I mean, we saw it before the election where they were going into meetings with the Conservatives. I think the industry, and that side of the industry in particular, and it's hard for them because they are partisan, and you're allowed to be an executive and also partisan, but to the degree that they're seen as moving in lockstep with the Conservative Party and vice versa, I don't think it does either side there any great good. They need to be seen, the Conservatives need to be seen as supportive of industry, but not marching in lockstep. The industry needs to be seen as encouraging a party that is supportive, but willing to make deals with another party that's in government that can get some common ground done.
I'm going to leave you with this, Shawn. A former executive who will go unnamed because he doesn't want to be publicly attached to this comment, but observed to me a couple of weeks ago when I was in Calgary, he said, CAP has gone from being a policy shop to a partisan politics shop. And that was a senior executive who used to be a CEO of one of the major oil sands companies. So we'll leave it at that.
All right.
No, Shawn, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. There's lots to track over the next few weeks and months, and we'll look forward to having another chat with you in the near future.
Anytime. I am obviously happy to talk about these things.